I was 26 when I watched my grandpa's land disappear. Not slowly, not over the years the way farms fade when no one tends them, but in a single quiet afternoon when a red sold sign stood where his rusted mailbox used to be. Warren Farm, the place that smelled like motor oil and hay and black coffee at 5 in the morning, was gone before I could even drive down from Des Moines to ask what was happening. I stood on the gravel shoulder in office clothes, wind cutting through my coat, and I felt stupid for believing land was forever. Grandpa George never sold land. He survived the layoffs in 2008 by fixing tractors in the barn and renting half the field to the millers. He used to say land is the last thing you sell because once it is gone, you cannot pray it back. He said it while tightening bolts with grease on his hands and a smile in his eyes. So when I saw that sign, I knew something was wrong. Not a mistake, not paperwork late, not some friendly deal between neighbors. Wrong. I drove straight to my mom's house. It was late November 2022. The air had that Iowa bite in it and the fields were brown and sleeping. Mom was at the kitchen table with bills spread everywhere. Rick Dalton, her husband of 3 years, was leaning back like he owned more than the chair. Before I could even ask, he said, "Don't worry, I handled the paperwork." From the way he said handled, I understood he thought I should thank him. I said, "Handled what?" He said, "The farm. We sold it. $500,000. Good price before winter." I stared at him, at Mom, at the window where snow was starting. I said, "Rick Grandpa left the farm to me." Grandpa said it to my face. Mom lifted her eyes like she was tired of hearing it. "He was sick, honey. He did not want you tied down here. You have your job. You have your own life now." Rick chuckled like I had said something cute. "You are 26. You do not even know how to run a farm. Move on." He said it slow, "Move on." Like I was clinging to an old sweater and not to the only thing my grandfather built with his hands. That sentence burned more than the sale. It was not just move on. It was you do not matter in this decision. It was you are the youngest, so you do not get a say. It was that ugly thing in toxic family stories where the man who arrived last speaks the loudest. I said, "Why did no one call me? Why did no one ask me?" Rick said, "I saved you from property tax, kid. You should be thanking me." Mom nodded along like he was the reasonable one. She even said, "Your grandpa did not want you stuck here." How would she know? She was crying at the hospital when he told me record everything, Tess, truth has a voice. That night, I went back to the farm even though it was already dark. The porch light was off. The barn doors were locked. I used the code Grandpa always used and went in. His tools were gone from the main bench, like someone had already started clearing him out. I went to the small cabinet in the corner, the one he called his memory box. Inside, there were old receipts, his army photo, and a little silver voice recorder with a strip of tape on it that said, "Rick April." I held it in my hand, and suddenly the sold sign did not feel so final. He thought I would move on. He did not know Grandpa recorded everything. I did not know this would turn into a toxic family mess. I did not think our name would be dragged around town like some family betrayal story. I thought we were better than the families that lose everything over money, but money does strange things to people. This became a real revenge story over inheritance, over respect, over truth. I drove back to Maple Creek the next weekend telling myself I only wanted to help Mom sort through Grandpa's things. My job in Des Moines was steady and boring numbers all day in a cubicle. Being a junior accountant meant I understood paperwork better than most, and I planned to use that calm logic when I walked into that house. Still, the drive felt heavy. The highway looked the same, but the fields were colder now, gray stubble after harvest, and I could not shake the feeling that something inside me had been sold along with the land. When I reached the town limit sign, the church bell was ringing. I stopped there first because Mom always said Pastor Neil worried when I skipped Sunday. The old white building looked smaller than I remembered. After service, I was standing by the coffee table when Mrs. Perkins, who had known my family forever, smiled at me and said, "So Rick finally sold that farm. Smart man. Land tax is crazy." I felt my stomach drop. She said it like I had signed the papers myself. I forced a smile and said, "I guess so." She patted my arm. "It is good you are not tied down. A pretty girl like you should be in the city." I nodded, but my hands were shaking. Everyone in town already knew, everyone except me. On the drive to Mom's house, I kept hearing her voice. "Smart man. Land tax is crazy." It was the kind of talk that made sense to small towns. It sounded practical, but it hurt because it turned my grandfather's legacy into a bill to be paid. When I walked into the kitchen, Mom was baking. Rick was at the table flipping through a catalog of trucks. He did not even look up when he said, "Heard you went to church." I said, "Yes, and I heard you sold the farm." He smiled the way people do when they think you are naive. "I saved you from property tax, kid. You should be sending me flowers." I asked if I could see the sale papers. He laughed. "You are really going to check my math. You think I am cheating you." Mom looked uncomfortable and said, "Tessa, please do not start." Rick kept talking like she had not spoken. "I even paid for your dad's headstone Linda with the sale. You never thanked me for that either." My throat closed. He had used my father's death as proof of generosity. I said quietly, "Grandpa paid the land tax through next May." Rick froze for half a second before smiling again. Maybe he did. Maybe I did not need to worry about it now that the land is gone. He stood and poured himself coffee. The smell filled the kitchen and I wanted to scream because everything looked normal while everything felt wrong. I asked Mom if she knew the sale was done. She sighed. "Rick handled it, sweetheart. He is just trying to help." Help who, I asked. She would not look at me. He put his arm around her and said, "You know how emotional she gets. You should be grateful." "Do you know how much property tax costs on a farm that size?" I said quietly, "About 1/5 of what you made selling it." His hand tightened on Mom's shoulder, but he kept smiling. "You think you know money because you work with spreadsheets. You do not know what real work is." The tone hit me harder than the words. It was not about the farm anymore. It was about power. He was reminding me who was in charge now. I went upstairs to the room that used to be mine and sat on the bed looking at the old wallpaper. The smell of cinnamon from the kitchen drifted up and made my stomach twist. Grandpa used to say paper does not lie. I pulled out my laptop and searched the county record system. The sale was listed under Dalton's LLC, not our family name. There was no mention of me anywhere. The bill of sale line that should have listed my signature was blank. I closed the laptop and stared at the ceiling. I thought of how easily people like Rick rewrite stories. In every toxic family, there is someone who takes what is not theirs and convinces everyone else it was for the best. The quiet ones who know the truth are told to move on. But I was not ready to move on. If this feels like your family conflict justice story, stay with me. Some toxic family members do not stop at money, they go after your dignity. Rick decided to host a family dinner the following Saturday to celebrate what he called a smart financial decision. I came home from Des Moines thinking it was just going to be Mom and him, maybe some quiet talk about bills and what to do with Grandpa's tools. But when I walked in, I smelled roast beef and heard laughter from the dining room. Aunt Marcy was there with her husband Gary. Marcy was Rick's younger sister, a woman who had something to say about everyone. She hugged me with perfume that stung my eyes and said, "Look at you, city girl. I heard you finally let that land go. Smart move. Not everyone can handle land. Some kids just cash out." Her words hit like a slap disguised as advice. I froze and looked at Mom. She smiled weakly and said, "It is nice to have everyone together." Rick was carving meat with a grin. He said Tessa is learning that responsibility comes in many forms. I stepped up when she decided to move on. I felt the air leave my chest. Move on. The phrase again. He had turned his theft into a story where I was the lazy child who did not want to carry the family burden. I said I never agreed to sell anything. He put the knife down and looked straight at me. "You never said you would take care of it either. I did what had to be done." Mom said quickly, "Not at the table, Tessa, please." Her tone was pleading, but it sounded like betrayal. Everyone went quiet. Marcy cleared her throat and said, "Property taxes are murder these days. You are lucky Rick took care of it." I clenched my napkin. Grandpa paid the taxes. He always paid them ahead. Rick laughed softly. "Not this time. He had debts you did not know about." I looked at Mom. She kept staring at her plate. Then Rick added, "I even paid off some of your mom's credit card debt. You should thank me." That made me snap my head up. Mom had cleared that card months ago. I said, "Which card, Rick?" He smirked. "The one with the medical bills. I paid it with the sale because I am not a monster." I glanced out the window and saw his new truck parked in the drive, gleaming red in the porch light. The kind of truck that cost more than some houses around here. He followed my gaze and said, "What you looking at?" "You think I bought that with your grandpa's money?" I said calmly. "I think you used part of it to pay for something shiny." He leaned back in his chair. "You think I am some kind of crook?" "I think you are lying," I said. The silence cracked open the room. Gary tried to joke. "Come on now, this is family." Rick picked up his glass. "That is right. Family means doing what needs to be done. Some of us act. Some of us just talk." Mom whispered, "Please stop, both of you." He smiled at her and said, "I will stop when she understands." Then he turned to me. "You are 26 and single. You do not need a farm. You need to build your own life." The words sank deep because they were not just mean, they were final. He was closing a door and making sure I knew he held the key. I stood up, but my knees felt weak. Mom said, "Sit down, honey." He did not mean it. He said I meant every word. I earned that money, and I made sure it did not go to waste. I walked out without a coat. The air outside was cold and sharp, and I could still hear their laughter behind me. I sat in my car and tried to breathe. The steering wheel was cold under my hands. I stared at the farm road disappearing into darkness and thought about how betrayal never comes from strangers. It comes from people who share your table. I whispered to myself. This was not just family. This was betrayal. Family karma hitting me in real time. It was not about land anymore. It was about being silenced by money and arrogance. It was about being erased while smiling faces pretended everything was fine. I started the car and promised myself I would not let this story end at their dinner table. If someone ever used money to silence you, this revenge emotional story is for you. Don't click away. The next morning, I walked into Maple Creek Community Bank with a folder full of old documents and my stomach tied in a knot. The building smelled like coffee and furniture polish. Janet, the teller who had known my grandfather for years, looked up from her counter and smiled. "Morning, Tessa. I have not seen you in a while." I tried to smile back. "I need a copy of the closing statement for the Warren farm sale, please." She hesitated. "Are you on the account?" I said, "My name should be. It was his estate and I am his granddaughter." She looked at me for a long moment, then disappeared into the back. While I waited, I watched an old man counting coins by the window. Every sound of clinking metal felt like a clock, ticking too loud. Janet came back holding a thin stack of papers. She lowered her voice. "Technically, I am not supposed to show you this, but you should see it. The line for total sale price read $500,000, but below that was a new line I had never seen before. Consulting fee, $30,000, payable to Richard Dalton." My chest went cold. "What consulting?" Janet whispered. "I probably should not say, but your grandpa told me once this land was meant for you. He said he wanted it safe in your name before spring." I nodded, but my eyes were burning. I thanked her and left. Outside, the air felt thinner. I sat in my car staring at the statement. Rick had not only sold the land, he had paid himself a commission for stealing it. I drove straight to Mom's house. The driveway was full of trash bags and boxes. When I stepped inside, the living room was half empty. The glass cabinet that used to hold Grandpa's medals and his pocket watch was open and bare. I went to the hallway closet. Even the old leather tool belt was gone. I checked Facebook on my phone. There it was. a listing for a vintage watch identical to Grandpa's with the caption, "Slightly used, good condition, pick up only." The seller profile was Rick Dalton. My hand was shaking so hard I nearly dropped the phone. I walked into the kitchen. Rick was at the table writing something on a yellow pad. "Where are Grandpa's things?" I asked. He did not look up. "Cleaning out clutter. Some of it is being sold for parts." "People collect this junk." I said, "That junk is our family history." He laughed. "History does not pay hospital bills." I stared at him. "You took $30,000 from the sale for yourself." He looked at me finally, his smile gone. "I paid for your mom's surgery last year. I earned this." I said, "You took care of her because you are her husband, not because it was an investment." He stood up his chair, scraping the floor. "You think you know sacrifice. You think fixing numbers in a city office makes you better than the man who put food on your mother's table." I said quietly, "You are not putting food. You are selling everything that fed us." He slammed his hand on the table. "Watch your tone." I walked out before my voice broke. I drove to a small roadside motel and checked in with cash. The room smelled like bleach and old carpet. I sat on the bed and opened the little box I had taken from Grandpa's cabinet the night of the funeral. Inside was the voice recorder. I pressed play. The tape clicked and hissed, and then his voice filled the room, soft and steady. "This land is for Tessa. Do not sign anything without her." I closed my eyes. There was another file on the recorder marked April 2. I pressed it. The sound was muffled, but I heard Rick's voice clear enough. "She is a girl, George. She will not fight it." There was a pause and the sound of Grandpa clearing his throat like he always did before speaking. Then silence. The recording ended. I sat there listening to the hum of the air conditioner, thinking about how men like Rick count on women not fighting back. He had underestimated the wrong girl. I backed up the recordings onto my laptop and sent copies to my email just in case. I looked at the clock. Midnight. My reflection in the dark window looked like someone I did not recognize, someone who had stopped hoping things would get better and started planning how to make them right. You are watching a real story, financial revenge, inheritance, drama family. If you have ever been pushed out of what was yours, stay. This quiet justice is coming. Rick found out about the bank visit the way a storm announces itself quick and loud. He did not come to the kitchen that evening with questions. He came with accusation in his eyes and a kind of small animal panic that I had never seen before. I was folding a towel when he shouted, "Whose idea was it to poke around at the bank, you trying to start trouble?" I held the towel until my fingers went numb and said I just asked for a copy of the closing statement. He took 2 steps into the room and knocked my phone off the counter with a flat palm, so it slid and hit the floor and stopped on the tile like something broken. The sound in that moment was sharp and ridiculous and somehow final. I picked it up and the screen was dark and his face was hard. "Maybe you should have left it alone," he said. "Maybe you should have trusted me." My voice was small. I said, "You had no right to sell it." He laughed, the kind of laugh that pretends offense is the same as power. "You do not get to tell me what I can do in my own house," he said. I called Mom, and she came in with flour on her hands and that old, tired look like she was already exhausted from choosing between people. He turned to her and said, "Either she goes or I go." The words were simple, and they were a kind of verdict. For a moment, the kitchen was quiet except for the clock and the cupboard door swinging on its hinges. Mom looked at me for a long time, and I saw in her face the exact second she decided where her comfort lay. She reached for Rick's hand and squeezed, like I had not been the daughter sitting across from her my whole life. "Please, Tess," she said in a voice that tried to sound kind but broke into something else. Rick folded his arms and said, "You should go stay with your friend until I sort things out." I could not make my legs move. I gathered what I could in 10 minutes, a laptop in a canvas bag, the little recorder in its case, a photograph of Grandpa in overalls, and the blue flannel that used to be his. I put them in the trunk of my car like someone packing a cardboard life. When I reached the front door, Rick was already standing there with his coat the way people stand when they are waiting for a bus they paid for. He did not look angry so much as economical. He said, "You are making a scene. The neighbors are going to talk." I felt like I had been unstitched from the fabric of my family, and there was nothing I could do to sew myself back in. I left without shouting. Outside, the air hit me so hard my eyes watered. The streetlights carved the snow into strips of copper light, and the house behind me glowed warm and protected, and I was the only one shut out. I drove until I did not know where I was and pulled up to the old pickup that had sat by the barn for years. I climbed inside and wrapped the thin blanket Grandpa used to keep on the passenger seat around my shoulders. The truck seat smelled like the past and oil in his aftershave. I lay back and tried to breathe. The truck is not a home, but it is quiet, and in that quiet the tapes on the recorder were louder than the engine. Morning found me with frost on the windshield and hands that had almost forgotten what warmth felt like. I walked to Evan's house because he always kept coffee on the counter for wandering souls, and because he was one of the few people left who believed in simple things like decency and receipts. He saw me before I said hello, and his face moved in a way that made me think he had already guessed what had happened. "Tess," he said, "come inside." He wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and put a mug in my hands. The kitchen smelled like burnt toast in church, and he sat across from me and let me talk until the words came out like spilled marbles. I told him about Janet the teller and the consulting fee and the watch and the posts on the marketplace, and then I told him about the way Rick used Dad's death as leverage and how Mom had folded like paper. He listened, and then he said, in a quiet way that made me feel like it was no longer only my burden, "If you have his voice, Tess, you have your case." He did not say it like a threat. He said it like a fact. The recorder was not just proof, it was a witness. I thought about all the small ways people assume a woman will be quiet, how they design their plans to avoid the heat that comes when truth is made public. That was Rick's mistake. He assumed I would be silent. He had not counted the nights I would spend in truck seats or the way a recorder in a drawer can carry a man's words farther than 1,000 angry neighbors. I went back to the motel and hooked the laptop up to the little recorder. The hiss of the tape felt like a heartbeat, and I listened to Grandpa's voice again the way people read a last testament, not for money, but for the bones of what matters. I opened a cloud storage account and copied the files and set up a folder with Grandpa's name on it. Then I sent the files to my own email and to a backup account, and to a friend's email with a note that simply said, "If anything happens to me, these are safe." I did it slowly because I wanted the act of saving to feel deliberate as a prayer. Then I sat back and realized that there were ways to fight cleanly. The advertisements on the motel TV talked about legal hotlines and consumer protection, and I wrote down numbers the way a person lists ingredients for a recipe. I thought about the courts and about how small towns like ours can swallow versions of the truth if no one brings evidence to light. I thought about how the recorder made Grandpa more stubborn than he had been alive, how he would not let his voice be erased. The plan was not to shout it from rooftops, it was to bring it where it could not be ignored, to set it on a table in an official room, and let it speak with the authority of paper and seal and oath. I breathed in the motel air and felt a kind of resolve settle like grit that would not blow away. Before I slept, I uploaded the files to a cloud that was not tied to Rick's devices, and I put a copy on a USB drive and mailed it to my own P.O. box. The small acts felt like a chain, and each link made me feel less alone. This is what silent revenge looks like, not loud, not hateful, just truth and closure. The county courthouse smelled like old wood and nervous sweat, and the sound of shoes echoed off the marble floor as people came in whispering about what they were calling the family trial of the year. Rick had filed a defamation complaint against me after I posted a single sentence on my social media that said, "Truth has a way of finding a microphone." He said I had ruined his reputation. I said I had just told the truth. The clerk led me into the hearing room, where half of Maple Creek was already sitting in the back row pretending they had business there. I could see Mrs. Perkins whispering to someone, and even Pastor Neil leaning forward like he was watching a play. Rick was standing at the front in a pressed jacket holding a folder full of documents. He looked every bit the confident man who believed paperwork could cover sin. Mom sat beside him, her face pale but fixed in the same polite smile she wore at every funeral. When the judge entered the room, everyone rose, and I tried to steady my breathing. Rick began with a rehearsed tone. "Your Honor, I am here because this young woman has made false statements about me on a public platform, implying I mishandled her grandfather's property. I am a man of integrity. I handled that sale according to the law." He opened the folder and held up the deed like a trophy. The judge looked at me. "Miss Warren, do you have any response?" My palms were slick, but my voice came out steady. "Yes, Your Honor, I do." My grandfather recorded his conversations because he did not trust Mr. Dalton. Rick's head jerked toward me. The judge frowned. "Are you saying you have a recording relevant to this case?" "Yes, sir." I set my laptop on the table and clicked play. The courtroom filled with the sound of static and then the slow, steady voice of my grandfather. "This farm is for Tessa. She is all I got." The room went so quiet I could hear someone drop a pen. Then came Rick's voice, clear and sharp. "Then sign it over to me first. She will never know I can tell her I sold it to pay Linda's debt." A woman in the back gasped, and another older lady shook her head and whispered, "Shameful." Rick's face went gray. He turned toward Mom, but she would not meet his eyes. The judge leaned forward. "Is that your voice, Mr. Dalton?" Rick stammered. "That could be doctored. Anyone can edit audio these days." The judge motioned to the bailiff. "We will verify that in due course." He looked at me. "Miss Warren, do you have any corroboration?" I nodded. "Janet from the bank is here, Your Honor." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Call her in." A few minutes later, Janet entered, clutching her purse and looking like she would rather be anywhere else. She was sworn in and spoke softly but clearly. "I handled the transaction, Your Honor. The farm was valued at $500,000. $30,000 was listed as a consulting fee paid to Mr. Dalton's personal account." The judge tapped his pen on the desk. "And did Mr. Warren ever express his intent regarding the property?" "Yes, sir. He told me directly the farm was for his granddaughter, Tessa." The judge turned back to Rick. "Anything to say to that?" Rick's voice cracked. "That woman is lying." The judge lifted a hand. "Enough." He turned to the clerk. "Mark the recording and the bank statement as exhibits. We will suspend the defamation charge pending review of the property sale." The murmur in the room grew louder as people whispered. Pastor Neil shook his head slowly. Even Mom covered her mouth with one hand like she was seeing the edge of something she had tried not to believe. Rick's shoulders slumped. His lawyer whispered frantically, but it was clear the ground had shifted. The judge stood. "Until this matter is verified, Mr. Dalton, I recommend you refrain from further accusations." He looked at me. "Miss Warren, we will notify you when a full hearing is scheduled." As the room emptied, people avoided looking at Rick. A few came to squeeze my hand or whisper, "You did good, honey." Mom stayed seated a long time before she stood and said quietly, "I did not know, Tessa. I swear I did not know." I said, "I believe you, but belief and trust are not the same." She nodded and walked away. Outside the courthouse, the sun was too bright, and my hands were shaking from the weight of relief and the strange ache of justice starting to take shape. This is justice without hate. If you have ever had to fight toxic family with proof, drop a comment. Someone needs to hear your quiet justice, too. The ruling came 2 weeks after the hearing, and the courthouse felt colder that morning than it had before. The judge announced that the sale of Warren Farm would be reviewed in full and that the proceeds from the transaction were to be frozen until further notice. Rick's jaw tightened, but he did not argue. The order went through and the bank moved fast. Within a day, his personal account was locked and a letter arrived demanding the return of the $30,000 consulting fee. I heard from Janet later that afternoon. She said he had stormed into the branch, waving his hands and shouting about unfair treatment, but the manager refused to lift the hold. The LLC that had purchased the farm withdrew its claim, and their lawyer sent a public statement saying they wanted no part in any pending lawsuit. In Maple Creek, that kind of news traveled faster than a sermon. Within 48 hours, everyone knew. The Sunday after the ruling, the church was full, and Pastor Neil stood at the pulpit speaking about honesty. He said stealing from the dead is stealing from God. He did not name names, but no one had to ask who he meant. I sat in the back pew between two women who whispered the whole time, and when we stood to sing, they both turned to look at me like they were trying to measure whether I felt vindicated. Rick did not come that morning, and Mom sat near the front staring at her hymnal, as if it could erase the past month. On Monday, the phone started ringing at the store where Rick worked. He sold agricultural equipment, and the owner called him in before lunch and handed him a termination letter citing misconduct and damage to the company's reputation. He came home that night furious, and I heard from one of Mom's neighbors that he threw a chair on the porch and shouted at no one in particular. By midweek, word spread that several of his old friends had stopped returning his calls. At the diner where he used to eat breakfast every morning, the waitress refused to pour him coffee. "We do not want trouble here, Rick," she said and walked away. He left money on the table anyway, but the owner followed him out and told him not to come back. Mom's circle of friends changed too. Women she had known since high school started keeping their distance. When she stopped by the grocery store, Mrs. Perkins told her quietly, "You chose a man over your daughter. I hope he was worth it." Mom told me later she cried in her car for half an hour. I listened without saying much. There was nothing left to fix between us, only the slow acknowledgement of consequences. The town had decided that silence was safer than siding with him. Rick stopped showing up anywhere public, and his truck sat parked crooked outside the house with a for sale sign that no one believed. Through all of it, I said nothing. I did not post victory photos or argue online. The only thing I wrote was one line on my page. Truth plays louder than gossip. It was not about revenge, it was about weight, the kind that settles when noise finally stops. I went back to work in Des Moines and kept my focus on the review process. The county records office confirmed what we already knew: the recording was authentic and the signatures on the sale contract had been manipulated. The farm's deed was put under temporary protection until the legal claim could be resolved. When the notice came, I did not celebrate, I just printed it and pinned it to my wall. Some people think justice feels like cheering, but for me it felt like exhaling after holding my breath for months. I stopped checking what people in town were saying and started planting small steps toward rebuilding. I spoke to a lawyer about future estate planning workshops for women because I realized how many families fall apart the same way ours did under the weight of control and money. Meanwhile, Rick's world kept shrinking. The truck sale failed, the buyers backed out, and his credit lines dried up. He tried to appeal the frozen funds, but every request was denied until the investigation was complete. Mom moved into her sister's spare room for a while, and I sent her small amounts of money each month, even though she never asked. She said I was the only one who still answered her calls. I said quietly, "You are still my mother." She said I do not deserve that, and I said, "Maybe not, but Grandpa would want me to." What I did not tell her was that forgiveness was not the same as forgetting. Sometimes revenge through truth hurts more than yelling. This is reclaiming respect. 4 months passed before I heard his voice again. By then, winter had melted into mud season, and the farm had been quiet for weeks. The review process ended in my favor, and the deed was restored to the Warren name with my signature finally, where it should have been from the start. Rick lost the appeal, and the frozen funds were absorbed into restitution payments. His truck had been repossessed, and he was renting a small unit on the edge of town where the siding peeled off in the wind. When the call came, I almost did not answer. His voice was thinner now, rasping like a man chewing pride. "Tessa, we are family. Your mom is suffering. Can I at least stay at the farm till this clears up?" I listened without saying anything for a moment and then told him to meet me there the next afternoon. When he arrived, he looked smaller in person, like the months had taken his edges. His coat hung off his shoulders and his eyes darted around the yard that used to be his trophy. "You cleaned it up," he said quietly. I nodded. He walked toward the porch as if expecting an invitation inside. I stopped him with a hand on the railing. "I told you to meet me, not to move in." He frowned. "I just need a place to stay until I figure things out." I said, "You already figured things out when you sold it." His jaw tightened, but he followed me to the barn where I had papers laid out on a table. I handed him a copy of the new lease agreement. "The farm is being rented to a local farmer on a seasonal contract," I said. "It keeps the land working and the taxes clean." He flipped through the pages like a man looking for an escape clause. "You said I should move on, remember? Now it is your turn." He looked up at me, and for a second, I saw something close to fear. I reached into my bag and pulled out the small recorder, the same one Grandpa had used, and held it out to him. "Keep this," I said. "You might need to remember what you said." His hand shook as he took it. I could see the moment he realized it was both mercy and reminder. He started to speak, but no words came. The wind carried the sound of the new tenant's tractor starting in the distance, and it drowned whatever apology he had been about to fake. He turned to leave, and I watched him cross the yard that had once been his prize walk and now was just dirt beneath someone else's boots. Later that week, Mom came to see me. She looked older, her hands trembled when she poured coffee. "He is not well," she said softly. "They cut off his utilities. He is still my husband. Can you help him?" I looked at her for a long time. I helped Grandpa, that was my job. Helping the man who stole from him is not. She nodded and wiped her eyes. "I know I just thought maybe you could spare something." I said I did spare something. I spared him a roof he could not steal. She laughed once, a small sound full of sadness. Before she left, she said, "I'm proud of you, even if I do not know how to say it right." When she drove away, I stood by the gate, watching the sun go down over the field that was finally mine again. The light caught the new fence posts and turned them gold. I thought about the quiet ways people learn their lessons and how sometimes losing everything is the only truth that sticks. Later that night, I got another call from an unknown number, but I did not answer. Some doors stay closed, not out of anger, but because peace needs room to grow. This is standing up for yourself. This is truth and closure. You can love your family and still say no. 1 year passed before the place began to feel alive again. The weeds were gone and the earth had been turned for planting. The wooden sign at the gate read Warren Legacy Field, carved by a local craftsman who refused to take payment. Every morning I walked the rows of new crops and thought about how silence can sometimes grow stronger, roots than noise. The farm was leased to a family named Cooper who worked the land with quiet discipline and sent me weekly updates about yields and soil. The house had been repaired and repainted pale yellow the way Grandpa always said it should be. It looked like it was breathing again. Around that time, I started a small weekend workshop at the community hall called Protecting What You Inherit. It began with 3 women from the church and grew to 20 by the 3rd month. Most of them were middle-aged or older widows or daughters trying to keep their homes safe. We sat in a circle drinking coffee while I explained paperwork and estate forms in plain English. I told them what to ask bankers and what to record when someone says, "Trust me." The stories they shared could have filled a book. One woman lost her husband's pension to her brother-in-law's signature. Another found out her sons had sold her cabin while she was in the hospital. Every story carried the same echo of betrayal and the same hunger for peace. We laughed sometimes, too, because healing sneaks in when women share the same kind of hurt. I used Grandpa's story as an example without naming names. I said justice does not always wear a uniform. Sometimes it wears work boots and waits for the harvest. People nodded and wrote that down. On the first anniversary of winning the case, I went out to the field alone. The sky was wide and gold, and the air smelled like cut hay. A small group of volunteers had helped me install a bench by the fence line. On the back was engraved, "For George Warren, who believed truth should never be buried." I sat there for a long time watching the sunset slide across the rows of green. That was when I heard a car pull up. It was Mom. She walked slowly across the dirt, her shoes sinking a little with each step. When she reached me, she said I wanted to see it. "It is beautiful." I nodded. She took a breath like she was carrying something heavy. "I chose comfort over truth," she said. "I thought keeping peace was the same as doing right. I was wrong." Her voice broke on the last word. I looked at her and saw the woman who had once braided my hair before school, the woman who used to hum while cooking dinner. I said, "You do not have to explain." She shook her head. "Yes, I do. I hurt you when I should have protected you. I forgave the wrong person and lost both of you for a while. Can you ever forgive me?" I said I already did. Forgiving you is not the same as letting him back. She nodded slowly. "He is gone," she said. "He left town a few weeks ago. I hope he finds something better than what he became." We stood together for a while, listening to the wind. When she left, she turned back once and waved. I watched her car disappear down the gravel road until all that was left was dust. As the light faded, I took out the small recorder one last time. There was one tape I had never played marked June, his last month alive. I pressed play. Grandpa's voice came through soft and calm. "If anyone ever tries to take what is yours, Tess, let the truth speak. You do not have to scream." I closed my eyes and felt the weight of every word settle in my chest. The horizon turned the color of ember and the sound of crickets rose from the field. It was the sound of closure. I sat there until the stars came out and thought about how justice is not about winning, it is about remembering who you are when everything else is stripped away. If you believe in quiet justice and silent revenge, in dignity over money, share this. Some women need to know justice without hate is real. This is your lesson in betrayal and reclaiming respect.